So as humans, we love stories. I mean, how often do our conversations begin or include phrases like, just wait till you hear what happened at, or, so the other day, or, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. You see, unless we are a typical teenager whose answer to their parents' question, how was school, is an unenthusiastic, okay. Our normal way to communicate about what has happened in our life will be through narrative. Heck, I mean, even the way I write these posts, I usually still roughly follow Campbell's 3-act structure so that there's a feeling of story to my short essays. Because there's power in stories. For example, currently in the UK, there's a huge scandal going on with the post office. You see, between 1999 and 2015, a software error led to over 900 people being falsely convicted for stealing money. Now, the wrongfully convicted did sue and the government did lose, and over the past several years, slowly some of the people have been declared innocent and compensated. But however, even though there was on average a court case every week during that time, for the most part, the average UK citizen had no idea what was happening. Until they did. Well, what changed? Well, this tragedy was finally told in the form of a story. Mr. Bates versus the Post Office aired on TV earlier this year, and as someone who lives in the UK, let me tell you, I could feel the impact. Because suddenly, everyone was talking about it. It was in all the newspapers. It was the headline for every news show. If you went for a pint at the pub, you would overhear 3 different conversations on the topic. The Prime Minister made a statement. People demanded action. And it was all because the story had been told. So it's no wonder that when we come to the Bible, a collection of ancient writings from the Middle East, the number one type of literature we find in it is narrative. I mean, the Bible begins with a story. In the beginning marks the entry into an epic tale of a God who created all things. I mean, even Jesus favored using parables, short fictional stories to teach spiritual truths. As this type of writing is so integral to the Bible, we should make sure we understand how narratives work so that we can read the Bible better. Now, there are a lot of aspects to narratives, which is why this journey will take us several weeks. But today, let's just focus on 2 big picture ideas. The first foundational block we need to understand is that a story essentially has 3 ingredients: a character, a goal, and an obstacle. Right? A dog wants to catch the ball in the air is a story. But if you take one element away, you just have an event. A dog is running. A ball is thrown. A dog has a ball in its mouth. Those aren't stories, those are just parts of the story. So when we read that David goes to fight Goliath, or Abraham leads his son up a mountain to sacrifice him, we should notice what parts of the story fill the 3 aspects. Each of these stories has a main character, David or Abraham. They're attempting to do something, slay Goliath and offer a sacrifice. But to do so, they must overcome an obstacle, right? Goliath is a huge warrior, and Abraham has been asked to sacrifice his own son. Now you may be wondering, okay, well, yeah, that sounds good and all, but how will identifying these simple elements help me read the Bible better? Well, that's because the lessons of the Bible become clear when we start wondering about any of those details. Who is David? Who is Goliath? Why would Abraham sacrifice his son? Will he sacrifice his son? And most importantly, was the character successful? You see, stories want us to ask questions, but you can't ask questions if you don't know what it is that you should be asking about. And remember, the first goal for us readers is to discover what the author's intentions are. And the best way to do that is to ask better questions. Let's use Ruth as an example. In chapter 1, we are told about Elimelech, who takes his family out of Israel to look for food because of a famine. In other words, we have a character, Elimelech, a goal, find food, and an obstacle, a famine. We then start to ask questions. Well, who is Elimelech? Where is he going? Does he succeed? Well, we see that Elimelech is a Jew who is leaving Bethlehem to go to Moab. We see he has his family with him. And maybe most importantly, we find out that he dies. Elimelech fails to achieve his goal. Well, why is that important? Well, because when we notice the failure, we can then start asking, well, why did the failure happen? This examination leads us to notice big picture details, like how it appears that Elimelech is taking matters into his own hands to provide for his family. Instead of depending on God for provision, he leaves the promised land to go somewhere foreign. So maybe the author's intent behind Ruth has something to do with depending on the Lord, or the Lord being a provider. But this digging starts to reveal other aspects that may take us closer to what the writer is trying to communicate. We may realize that a family leader taking their family to a different country because of a famine is the beginning of other stories in the Bible. Or we may discover the complicated history between Moab and Israel. We could even uncover that Bethlehem means house of bread in Hebrew, which means that we're reading about a person who's leaving a place known for its abundance of food to find food. And all this buried treasure is found within a few verses of the first chapter of a very small book. And this excavation started because we identified the three general parts of a story. Because if there's anything true about stories in the Bible, it is that there's always more going on below the surface. Which may bring a different question to mind. How do we get below the surface? Well, this idea of figuring out the big categories isn't that hard. But when it comes to the details, it can start to be a challenge. Luckily, as we start to move into the forest to look at the trees, we will learn how to identify a trail and notice different plants and see how it's all connected. But for now, before we can start doing that, there's one other big picture concept we need to understand, what I like to call the fiction spectrum. Essentially, all stories share similar aspects, right? Like the three we have already talked about. But that does not mean every story is trying to tell a true story. If you walk into a bookstore or a library, there are usually two very big categories that divide almost all the works that are being stored there: fiction and nonfiction. Fiction, of course, is fictional. They're made up stories about whether they are about hobbits trying to destroy an evil ring or magical boys who live in cupboards under their abusive relatives' stairs. Nonfiction, on the other hand, deals with real happenings in the world, both historical and present. But the truth is, all nonfiction narratives have a little bit of fiction in them, and all fictional narratives have a little bit of nonfiction in them as well. Like if I was to tell you about the time that I was hit by a car, I could give you a list of facts. I was in my backyard that had an alleyway behind it. I was playing football. I ran in front of a car to make a catch. That's boring. That's just not a fun way to tell this story. Instead, I would probably tell you about how I was racing down the field to catch the twirling pigskin. If I could score, victory would be secured. My concentration on winning had a side effect though, one in the form of a metal machine on wheels. I didn't see the car, but the driver did see me. Slamming on his brakes did benefit me in the end, but did not prevent the collision that was about to happen. And that was the roughest tackle I had ever experienced. See? Isn't that a better way to tell the story? Now, I just told you a true story, but instead of a series of events, it now becomes a gripping tale of athletics and injury. Okay, well maybe not gripping, but for sure more interesting and hopefully a bit more fun. To be able to tell this story in this way, I have to use the power of narrative, which means for my nonfiction tale, I use some of the techniques that come from fiction. There's also this issue that the story is being told from my perspective, which means that there's a bias in the story to begin with. So the fiction spectrum is this. If you could imagine a line with fiction at one end and nonfiction at the other, that's it. That's the fiction spectrum. The fact is, any story that we are going to tell will fall somewhere on that line. And where the story falls on that spectrum will tell us a lot about the intentions the author had when he or she wrote. And you may be wondering, am I just over-explaining things again? Maybe. But this concept of understanding that there's a bit of fiction and nonfiction is important to remember as we start getting deeper into the forest, because next week we're going to start talking about history and the Bible. You know, a topic that never gets controversial. But as we wrap up, remember, whenever you find a narrative in the Bible, first look for the three aspects: character, goal, and obstacle. Also, remember that this story is going to fall somewhere on that fiction spectrum, something that we're going to talk about a lot more later. But for now, let's just meditate on the fact that the main way we learn about the being that created us is through story. I mean, no wonder we love stories. We all bear the image of a master storyteller. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this was a blessing to you. If you liked it, please subscribe. Please share it with others. If you would like to receive this in written form in your inbox every week, you can click on the link down below to get to the blog version of it. Or if you'd like to just listen to it, the audio, I have it also in podcast form down below. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next week.